This morning, our plenary speaker, Emily Bell, is well known to audiences who don't even profess any interest in journalism, but those of us who do know her well. She graduated from Oxford University Christchurch in '87 with a master's in jurisprudence, and in 2010 she was appointed Professor of Professional Practice and Director of the Tau Centre for Digital Journalism at the Columbia Journalism School. We probably know her best and came to public prominence as Editor-in-Chief of the online Guardian Unlimited from 2001 to 6, and then Director of Digital Content for the entire Guardian News and Media from 2006 to 10. What she's less likely to say, but we need to acknowledge, is that in her time at the Guardian, she has made an extraordinary impact on the future of journalism and is one of the key shapers. The paper received a flood of awards for its website in 2005, 6, 7 and 9, as well as British Press Awards for Website of the Year in 2006, 8 and 9. I'm delighted that we're going to have a chance now to hear more about the vision. She's given her thoughts today the intriguing title of the many bracketed futures, bracketed S, of journalism. So I will leave the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much indeed, Bob. It's great to see you all here this morning. I did a terrible thing with the title, which is I was given the title The Future of Journalism, which is actually a perfectly good title. But being a journalist, really not a professor, because I am a professor, but I'm not, like many of you here, a proper professor, as academics often tell me. I thought I would do that thing of trying to edit the title of the session to make it sound more interesting. So having SEO'd the title to The Many Futures of Journalism, when I actually came to write the piece, I'm not sure it necessarily lived up to it. So blame it on SEO. Thanks very much indeed, Bob, for inviting me here. It's great to be in Cardiff. It's great to be at this school, which has done so much in terms of training the journalists of the past and the journalists of the future, indeed, in Britain. And it's also great to be in an organisation or an institution which convenes sessions like this one and debates around the future of journalism. I actually had a sort of something of a Twitter fight yesterday. It wasn't a fight, it was a robust discussion, where somebody made the obvious statement that we should stop discussing the future of journalism and start actually doing it. I'd just like a show of hands, actually. Who thinks we should stop discussing the future of journalism and start doing it? Come on, you can put your hands up. I'm not going to get... But what I actually said was I thought this was completely wrong. I'm not ashamed to be here. In fact, I'm glad to be here talking about the future of journalism, because when I started as a journalist, which was in 1987, I think I can confidently say that nobody discussed the future of journalism. The only discussion that we had about the future of journalism really began and finished with the disputes at Wapping, which I see is now to be sold off. Because it was very much felt that technology was about the printing process, it was about the distribution chain, that it had really pretty much nothing to do with our jobs in the newsroom. As I like to say to my students, I might look 150, I'm not actually 150. In fact, I'm 46 next week. I'm also very glad to be talking to you now, because 46 is the age at which women officially disappear. Which is handy. I know this to be true because I read it in the Daily Mail. So I'm particularly pleased to be able to get in and talk to you before I dematerialise next Wednesday. Yes, so 25 years ago, there was, I think, almost no discussion at all of the future of journalism. There was, I think, an acceptance that what academia was there to do was to train journalists and to put them into a profession which was pretty heavily templated, and the skills of the Even at the place that I worked, The Guardian, which was a great organisation to work for, there was, if you like, a sort of a part of the constitution there was that any editor who should take on the mantle would carry on as heretofore. And it was generally just accepted that the best way to do journalism was the way that it had always been done. But when Bob sort of pitched me this title many months ago, and I rather idiotically changed the title to The Many Futures of Journalism, why would I do that? Well, Bob's already said it, which is there are no silver bullets. You know, we know there to be no silver bullets. But one of the reasons there are no silver bullets is because journalism is just becoming less defined by the business that supports it, and it's more defined now by the activities which comprise it. So in other words, we see the elements of journalism now scattered in many directions. We're left with this rather fuzzy shape-shifting, sorry, I've also been travelling for about 48 hours, it feels like, which is too long to get from New York, but never mind, apparently when it rains, transport doesn't work. We're left with a very fuzzy proposition, which tends to dodge definition. Now, one of the great things about journalism, I think, is that it's not a certified profession. I now teach at a graduate school of journalism alongside a graduate school of medicine, a graduate school of business, a graduate school of law, but it's a craft. I can't actually be arrested for pretending to be a journalist when I'm not, or for sneaking into a newsroom and performing journalism when I might not be vaguely qualified. So arguing over who might be a journalist and who isn't is largely, I think, these days futile. If Julian Assange says he's a journalist or an editor-in-chief, then he says that. Or if Rebecca Brooks says she's a journalist, then she can say that as well. Or indeed, if a person standing in the street with an iPhone taking pictures of riots says that they're a journalist, well, for that moment, who's to say that they're not? No one is going to ask to see their card, no one's going to ask to see their qualification. We can gather around individual items of journalism and stroke our chins, as we often do, and wondering out loud, yes, it's good, but is it journalism? And we can stretch the metaphor for 5 minutes around the world of modern art and say that we can probably even agree that in the future everyone will be a journalist for 15 minutes. Some of us actually would hope to be journalists for slightly longer than 15 minutes. The sprawling ecosystem where the professional and the amateur are sometimes indistinguishable, and the human and algorithmic are actually increasingly converging. Journalism, I think, continues to evolve. So to pick a single future is going to be very, very hard. It can't really have one future. It can have a future as part of the information ecosystem. It can have a future as a business. It can have a future as a profession, I hope, and I certainly think it does have a future as a profession. And it has a future as a process. But perhaps unlike times in the past, and certainly, as I say, unlike the time when I started being a journalist, none of these futures are necessarily codependent. And because we're right at the beginning, I do believe we're right at the beginning of that process of redefinition, those who are most engaged with its continuing good health, I think, are most able at the moment to influence good outcomes. So which futures of journalism should we pick to look at? There are, at the end of the day, two that probably matter most that we should think about, and I would think that most people in this room are most engaged with. There's the future of good journalism, and there is the future of bad journalism. So let's start there. And at this point, because it's not enough really to discuss the future of journalism, I'd just like to discuss the past of the future of journalism and how we thought about it then, if I hope you're keeping up. So forgive the recap, but the argument around what was going to happen to the future of journalism about 5 years ago was that the future was going to be very good for bad journalism. How so? Well, first of all, it would take away funding, so there would be fewer journalists doing good journalism. Good journalism needs more journalists, not fewer. Secondly, it was going to be good for bad journalism because it would open the opportunity of journalism or acts of journalism to any fraud or idiot wanting to maraud around the internet, perpetuating lies, peddling false information, pretending to be people who they weren't. Thirdly, I hope you're recognising some of these arguments because they certainly are, they resonate in my memory. It was going to be very good for bad journalism because it was going to strap us to a hamster wheel. Live reporting. Can you be strapped to a hamster wheel? I don't know. You're going to be confined to a hamster wheel. Sacrificing in analysis, in-depth, contemplative journalism for a live stream and torrent of events, which would actually de facto be bad for journalism. The future of journalism also, and I remember this from past debates about the future of journalism, was going to be very bad because it would be dominated by technologists who pretty much knew nothing of our art. I remember really vividly, and this is something that forgive me, any of you who've actually been in a sort of a seminar room with me at Columbia in the last year, because this is something I relate quite often. In about 2005, I went to a closed seminar which put some technologists from Silicon Valley together with some journalists. One of the people there was from a very large and extremely successful search engine company. And many of the other people were from other very successful social networking sites, from various other businesses. The man from the very successful search engine spoke the truth, I think, to the journalists. And he said, look, the reason you don't have a model is because we have listened to your advertisers and your customers much more closely than you have. And we've devised a solution. We've done it better. And that's pretty much the end of the story. You know, that's why you don't have a business model or why you're sitting here complaining about us taking your business. It wasn't quite as blunt as that, but that was in essence the message. This resonated very deeply with me because I thought, well, he's pretty rude, but he's also right. We got out of the seminar and a very senior journalist turned to me and said, it's all very well, but they're not really in our business, are they? So that, in some ways, I think, was the problem then for the future of journalism. We saw this disruption and technology as being a wholly bad thing. We didn't think journalism was going to go away, but we did think it was all going to be bad. So my argument actually is looking at those elements of disruption, all of which incidentally have come to pass, is that we're still looking at those elements as really containing the future of journalism, but actually they favour good journalism. They favour good journalism, and they also, I think, will help eventually eliminate bad journalism. Well, not eliminate it, but render it all but irrelevant. What do we see here, then, that should make us feel optimistic? First of all, second show of hands. Who here feels broadly optimistic about journalism? Broadly optimistic. Who feels very optimistic? Good. Ian Holgrave feels very, very optimistic. Then I feel much better about feeling very optimistic. Who feels very pessimistic about journalism? Interesting. We can have a very good discussion for the next 45 minutes. What do we know about these future trends, and how will this be good for good journalism? I think one thing that used to sort of provoke profound depression was this idea of disaggregation. And this idea that journalism will be picked apart by other professions. It's back to the search engine. They're not really in our business. They are taking our business. Whereas actually what the future holds for journalism is an opportunity to actually reach out and into other disciplines, to learn from other spheres of activity, study, innovation, and actually bring those things back into journalism to improve it and to take it forward. It feels as though journalism has been in a defence mode for a long time, and it's beginning to break out of that defence mode, look outside its boundaries, and realise that these opportunities are there for taking. I think really the future of journalism lies beyond its own borders, or certainly its traditional borders. And the ability to understand and assimilate the skills and thinking that go with that is really what's going to make journalism good, or is making journalism good in the future. So first of all, let's take the sort of the things that was going to make journalism bad in reverse order. Journalism will be bad because it will be dominated by people who don't really understand journalism, by technologists, etc. I think the future of journalism is really very much about having to understand technology and the platforms that deliver it. 2 weeks ago, we took our first class of dual degree students who are a very rare form of humanity, who can both qualify for the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia and the Graduate School of Computer Science, and they'll be taking a dual degree. It's one of only a handful of courses available at the moment which does that, but already more of those are proliferating. It doesn't mean that just because they can code, they're not going to be sent out to report from the Bronx. In fact, the most excited they got in the first week was when they were given a camera and told to go and find a story out on the streets. But when they come back and say things like, this is really interesting, I'm having a great deal of fun. However, I'm just wondering if there isn't a better way to do X or there isn't a better way to do Y. One of them said, I'm very disappointed in how translation software works. It doesn't seem to work very well for reporters. Maybe there's something I can do for that. It's a kind of a whole new way of thinking about how to deliver journalism well. For a long time, we were actually, there used to be a phrase which somebody sort of coined at a very early conference about 2002 that I was at, where somebody said, the thing about talking about digital publishing and journalism is that the rest of digital publishing moves much faster than the arena of journalism. I don't think that's true anymore, actually. I think it's not just about our dual degree students, but I think that you see lots and lots of solutions now coming out of the technologically minded people within newsrooms. I think thinking about how to innovate and tell stories best is no longer in the hands of the technology companies. I think it's back in the hands of journalists. So, you know, the first day of reporting we had on Tuesday, first day that full class was in, we sent students out to report on the shootings in Brooklyn over Labor Day, because there were lots of shootings, an unusually high number. And on the first day of reporting, they started to gather the material as they always would have done. But this year, as opposed to last year, they could put it into a Storify story. So they could immediately start to aggregate both what they were finding out from their sources and what people were posting elsewhere and other material on the web. And they put it into a live blog format and came back incredibly energized. This just wouldn't have been possible a year ago. It would have taken us much too much kind of fiddling around with technology to make it right. You know, they learnt about storytelling. They're not instantly going to be the world's best journalists. But the very fact that you can now put this technology in students' hands, in anybody's hands, and have them do this work is great. So, you know, on day one now, people are given Storify, Document Cloud, Fusion, Google Fusion Tables, Audio Boost, SoundCloud, Vimeo, even dear old ancient Twitter, which is, of course, the oldest of microblogging technology. Now, the second thing that we thought would be bad for the future of journalism was the inclusion of the great unjournalistic masses. But actually, you know, this is, again, somewhere where we see not only has the inclusion of the great unjournalistic masses in journalism been tolerable, it's actually been beneficial. I was actually reading a paper on the train yesterday by Andrew Chadwick at Royal Holloway, which I'm not quite sure whether he's published or not yet, about the hybrid media system, where he looks at this in some depth, and it's an extremely good read. So if you haven't seen it, I would urge you to. Looking at how the boundaries of coverage and influence in the media are becoming much more porous and mingled between activists, other organisations, news organisations, and he picks up on WikiLeaks for exactly this reason. Again, WikiLeaks a year ago, I'm sure there are lots of people, I hope there are lots of people in this room who have papers or elements of research which are looking into it. We're starting to teach a seminar about it this fall because we said, sorry, autumn, I forget where I am. Because, you know, last year, several things happened. First of all, the way that information was disclosed was changed by WikiLeaks, or at least it showed us how that landscape has changed. And it brought forward a really extraordinary collaboration between 5 or 6 international publishers an organisation which is inherently about disclosing information, which could be a journalistic organisation, but we're not going to bother with classifications. So these kind of partnerships of hybrid information structures are really, really interesting, and I think extremely rich for the future of journalism. There was another one that I noticed during the Fukushima earthquake. I mean, we really have had an extraordinary year for laboratory news experiments. During Fukushima, I started to look at the MIT nuclear science blog, which was put up, a pop-up blog put up by some students, which every morning blogged in detail and non-journalistic but pretty clear language what the actual data and metrics from the site meant, what that interpretation was. It was not a journalistic activity. These people are not journalists, or they might be journalists for 15 minutes, but it was actually part of the system of journalism that was aggregated and pointed to by other news organisations which made journalism better. It's not usurped journalism by this ability to collaborate. And I think core skills will be how to actually make the best of that collaboration. In New York this week, I was just reading about the New York Times setting up a new project with the local radio station WNYC and 2 information sites relating to schools in New York. This is going to be a collaborative, data-driven website which is run by 2 media organisations and 2 databases to produce better stories and information about schools in New York. Now, I'm fairly sure that the aggregate of that will produce a more powerful product than the individual efforts of each of those silos. Also, it's my pleasure now not to work at The Guardian, but still to be able to boast about it. I'm not saying it's my pleasure not to work at The Guardian. It was a pleasure to work at The Guardian. I mean, it's nice to be able to sort of boast about it without it being in my job description. Recently, in covering the riots, I mean, first of all, that was a hugely social activity, and it meant aggregating lots and lots of sources. But having finished covering the riots, The Guardian, actually, I've got this on the prompt. It's all sort of changed to a slightly different format. But here we go. Hang on. No. If I can get the browser back. You've probably seen this actually, but if you haven't, one of the things that The Guardian did was it collected and analysed tweets. I don't know if have any of you seen this data, which is Oh, there we go. There we go. It's gone. That's not it. Hang on. Where's the... Oh, here we go. You can tell I'm a digital professor. Right. So they collected all the tweet traffic and analysed the data and plotted it onto a graph of what people were saying, when they were saying, and when the actual rioting occurred and what happened afterwards. Now, this might seem like a kind of a fantastically, it's good. I like a nice room of academics. They all sort of get very excited when they see some data and start nodding. Normally, if you put this up in front of an audience of journalists, there's a great deal of yawning and looking at their watches and saying, please don't tell me that I have to use Excel in my work. But the point behind this is that when David Cameron made his statement that the riots were caused or supported in some way by social media, there's almost no evidence to tie him to that to tie him to that statement or prove him wrong. But The Guardian's painstakingly collected all of this data and is now entering into a collaboration with the LSE and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to actually analyse the data and say, is it true? One of the things I'd love to do at Columbia, and I'd love to do at the Town Centre, I'd very much kind of be interested in hearing your thoughts, is start to provide a home for journalistic data sets like this, because we now throw off so much live data around stories, and yet it largely goes uncollected, unanalysed and unlooked at, because we've always felt that it wasn't part of journalism's role. Well, I think it is part of journalism's role, and I think it's great to say that we had to great to see that we have things like this going on, which go beyond the boundaries of journalism, but strengthen it. The other thing that was a challenge to journalism was the idea, or rather the idea of good journalism, is that instant journalism is bad journalism. So back to the hamster wheel point. Actually, I think that controversially, and I'm again welcoming pushback on this one, I think that really the most galvanizing and most beneficial things to happen to journalism, certainly in my working lifetime, have been the social real-time web and the proliferation of mobile devices. And these are all things that journalists felt profoundly uneasy about and challenged by. Hamster wheel doesn't have any good associations. Even if you're a hamster, I don't think they particularly like the wheels either. But if you say that it's conversational, it's contextual, it's valuable, it's linked journalism, delivered when and where it's of most use to people who are consuming it, then that feels a bit better than saying it's produced on a wheel. I don't think live journalism and stream journalism is hamster wheel journalism. I think hamster wheel journalism is repetitively, unthinkingly done journalism, which is just there to fill space. I noticed that Adam Westbrook, whose blog I regularly follow, was suggesting 10 things you always hear at a Future of Journalism conference. And one of them, I think he was complaining about this, is that someone will always mention Andy Carvin or Neil Mann. Well, there you go, I've done it. And I'm mentioning Andy Carvin and Neil Mann because these are journalists who now work beyond the platforms that they were given. Andy, social media strategist at NPR, and Neil being a producer at Sky News, actually using the available platforms of Twitter and their locations, Andy in his front room in Washington, Neil often out on location, to start to aggregate live streams of information and links is an incredibly enriching type of journalism which simply didn't exist before we had the platforms to deliver it. I've been watching real-time updates from, just on sort of the subject of Andy Carvin, to show you something which is not Andy Carvin. This is a tiny site called the Watershed Post. And Watershed Post came to my notice because I was, like everybody else, I was completely swept up in the storm porn of Hurricane Irene in New York a couple of weeks ago. And I wouldn't say that it was overhyped because it did billions and billions of dollars worth of damage, and I think sort of 46 people lost their lives. So this idea that it was overhyped is not necessarily true. I would say it was extremely badly covered because most of the damage and the lives lost were not actually at Nag's Head Beach, where you had a number of idiots in anoraks being buffeted, so shouting, "It's really windy out here," so you couldn't really hear it because the sound quality was so poor. In general, actually, the coverage was pretty good. The coverage of local stations, the coverage of the New York Times was terrific, which, again, used Twitter as a live stream way of putting out all of its live updates. But there was one small problem with the coverage, which is that as the storm blew over the 5 boroughs, the coverage dwindled as well. And actually, as the story moved upstate, nobody was covering it. I think CNN were the single network who carried on covering it. But I picked up this link from Jim Thomas, who's one of the editors at the New York Times, to this thing called the Watershed Post, which started to tweet in great detail about the damage that was being done to the Catskills, live photographs, live footage. And then I started to look a bit more into the background of who was doing this and what they were doing. And actually, it is literally a two-person, it's a two-woman operation. They started Watershed Post a year ago because they thought that the Catskills were not being covered, that this was a locality which had no regional or local press. And then I became sort of vaguely obsessed with the site, not just because it has this sort of stream of extremely good information, but also because they've pulled in things from outside the normal, if you like, sort of journalistic toolbox. They're using, I think this is WordPress's free blogging platform. They have this great thing here, which is the relief resources, which is just a Google Doc table that they've constructed. But they've made it possible, just by using, again, Google tools, for people to log either requests or offers of relief. They've put it on a spreadsheet so that everybody can see what is where, who needs what, when, and how. You know, this is very simple. It's very free. It's extremely useful. It can be done by 2 people. And it needs to be delivered in real time. So that's why I think that the live stream of journalism, the use of aggregated free tools, the involvement of people who are not necessarily journalists per se, is actually making our journalism much, much better. Now, this is my final and rather my most controversial point, which is the idea that the lack of revenue is not good for journalism and perpetuates bad journalism. This is a tricky one to pull off, because I'm not sure that I can actually really say that lack of money is good for journalism. But I might say it anyway. Well, okay. It's probably not good for journalism, but it's the reality that we live with. We did a research report out of the Town Centre in May, which was called, it was a very inspiring title. It was called The Story So Far, What We Know About the Business of Digital Journalism, which was very good because it was a report title that did exactly what it said on the cover. And it was a snapshot of dozens and dozens of US digital journalistic businesses and how they were doing. It also sought to take the temperature of how that market was remaking itself. And there are lots of, I'd urge you to kind of go on the website and have a look at it. But the overarching themes of that were very clear, one of which was that it's very important for journalists to understand the business that they are in, the costs that are associated with it, and how they can choose better options to do journalism in a more cost-effective way. But the other conclusion was perhaps not so optimistic or directional. It was that there just isn't going to be the same level of revenue coming into digital journalism businesses, not now and not for the foreseeable future, as there were into legacy media. So we are going to be working on resources. I mean, the drop in revenue, we've become so fetishized around the idea of a working business model for journalism that it's focused us, I think, sometimes in the wrong direction. And actually what we had from highly profitable journalism, that's my joke, there we go, at its worst, journalism which is done in the most sustainable and most profitable manner can actually be definitively the worst journalism. Journalism so bad that it actually closes a newspaper. And that's not a reflection on the majority of the good journalists who did good work at the News of the World, but it is a reflection on the problem that journalism has when its primary focus becomes profit. Well, the thing that I think can be said now is that the primary focus of most people interested in journalism is sustainability. And if you can seek profitability out of that, then that's also great. But it's not now, I think, the defining factor of why most people are in the journalism business. Collapse in revenues has forced innovation. It has forced debate about frameworks for support and intervention, which might not otherwise have happened. I sit on the advisory board of a regional American newspaper company called the Journal Register Company, run by a chief executive called John Payton, who you may not have heard of. Has anybody heard of him? A couple of people. Okay, well, you will do. John and his team took over the Journal Register post-bankruptcy, and it was the same story in regional newspaper after regional newspaper after regional newspaper, which was of closing titles, falling revenues, falling readership, no way out. This week, they took over a second company, or the management of a second company called Media News Group. In fact, that happened, I think, more or less yesterday, overnight. And the unsustainability of the old models have necessitated a complete rethink and a very, very aggressive digital-first strategy from JRC. John Payton wants to find a solution which makes regional and local news sustainable, which means trying everything, and it's done with a journalistic focus. I have the great privilege of being on an advisory board with Jeff Jarvis and Jay Rosen. Can I say it's the only board I've ever sat on in my life where I'm the person who says least. And the things that they are trying are really pushing journalism beyond what it was before. They have an open newsroom in Torrington, where the Register Citizen is the local newspaper. We actually had an advisory board meeting in the newsroom, and anybody could come and they did. So we sat there having our advisory meeting among the local teacher, librarian, somebody from local government, a number of just sort of curious and interested citizens. They took the view that if you're going to be a truly digital organisation, then taking the walls and the divisions between your community and you down, both in terms of your product and also in terms of your physical presence, is something that newspapers could benefit from because it creates engagement, it creates physical presence where you're likely to be withdrawing physical product. It's really sort of a project which has said everything is up for grabs. Like the Watershed Post, when stories happen, you use the best tools that are available, not the tools that you absolutely have to use because that's the way that your publisher says you must publish. It's been absolutely fascinating to see inside a company which is genuinely trying to produce an environment which creates good journalism, engage readers and new revenue sources. Will it work? Is the journalism that they produce going to be better than what went before? This was a question raised by Ken Doctor actually this morning, who said, this all looks great, it looks very promising, it's great to have somebody in the business who is interested about journalism, but will it be better? I think there's a great opportunity for people in this room to start to help measure and describe how that might be. Because the truth of the matter is, we don't know. We know the intention and we know the direction is right. And we also know that if it wasn't being done, we know how the story ends. We know the story ends with uncovered parts of the country. We know the story ends with closed newspapers. So, as we see companies being squeezed to the point of extinction, innovate and die takes on a new meaning of urgency. So, I think the lack of revenue, in a way, has made us look beyond that. It's also made new models emerge. I think that we've all been very squeamish, or certainly it's interesting being in America where there is no government intervention in journalism to speak of. There's a very small amount of funding which goes to public service broadcasters. But you do have, for instance, ProPublica, which was an innovative model in terms of being an investigative news outlet which was funded by philanthropy and donation. Now, again, I vividly remember when ProPublica was set up because the discussion around it was pretty much all negative. It would be impossible to do independent journalism like that. It's a very poor model and not-for-profit model in that way. It doesn't give you sustainability of journalism. Well, I'm not so sure. ProPublica now has a couple of Pulitzer Prizes under its belt. It has a newsroom which is certainly, I think, if not the most advanced, one of the most advanced in the world in terms of how it uses data and how it uses tools and how it uses technologies. It doesn't have a physical product. It distributes and partners its journalism with people who do have physical products. It puts out its own stories. It does stories for other outlets as well. And it's often written, not written off, it's often criticised just for being an anomaly or not quite like that. But it is, I think, a really clear demonstration of what you can do when you start to think and imagine beyond the boundary of journalism as we've understood it. So, I mean, those are my sort of 4 points gone over again. We could actually spend a whole session, and I hope you will, later on all the other things which I think are going to shape the future of journalism. Data, mobile devices and tablets, content management systems, any of these and all of these could be discussed at length. There's a huge amount of this development which isn't properly understood. And I'm not saying that everything is necessarily easy or right. I've given you an extremely Western-centric view of the world. It's easy to talk about business models and the sustainability of journalism in markets where there is plenty of journalism. It's harder to talk about them in markets where there is no free expression and where actually the set of challenges are very different, but also where the solutions are remarkably the same. The solutions, again, are in technologies, understanding how to use them, understanding how to circumvent other people who would seek to stop you from using them. There's no clear answer to my students who ask, what are you going to be doing in 5 years' time? And I don't think there's a clear answer to what will a news organisation look like in 5 years' time. But I think we can see plenty of clues about where some of these more sustainable models might emerge from. The future of good journalism is there to be defined. I think we do have all the right conditions. I've made an argument for the lack of funding being actually a benefit rather than a negative. And we certainly have the collective capacity to make all of this work. But we have to understand that this can only really be done by looking outwards, by looking up and outwards and into other disciplines. And by doing that and by taking their skills, I think we might understand and be able to do our own good journalism better. That's it. Thank you.